Hey, what's up? This is Caleb Ward, and in this After Effects tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this cool cell dividing effect. Alright, let's jump in. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create a new After Effects project. So I'm going to go to File, New, Project. And for this project, I'm going to do HD 1080p 24 frames per second. That all looks good. And we'll do duration of sight, 5 seconds long. Perfect. And click OK. So the first thing that I want to do is create cells in our actual composition. So I'm going to hit Command Y to create a new solid, and we'll call this cell 1. And its comp size looks good. I'll click OK. And what I'm going to do is use our mask tool here, our ellipse, to create a small circle right in the center. It's about that size. That looks good. And I'm going to add in a turbulent displace effect. And the default's a little too much, so I'm going to scale it down a little bit. Maybe to the amount to maybe about 25. And the size will bring down to maybe, I don't know, maybe about 40. That looks good, and by default it doesn't move. So in order to make it move, I'm actually going to add an expression to the evolution here. So I'm going to hold down Option and click the stopwatch, and I'm going to type in down here time times 200 and click away. So what this expression is basically going to do, for every second of our composition, it's going to get multiplied by 200. So if we scrub through, we can see our cell kind of moves and warps. And this is looking good. I'm liking the way this is looking. So I'm going to collapse this here, and I'm going to duplicate it, and the new cell we'll call cell 2. And this is looking good. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose this, and we'll call this cell home and click OK. So real quick, I'm going to go ahead and separate our cells out just a little bit so we can see whenever we're stylizing what both cells will look like together. All right, so in this composition, what I'm going to go ahead and do is create the outer membrane of our cell. So in our example, it was the lightning-like effect that was on the outside of the cell, and then we have the nucleus in the middle that will be the red center. So we're going to create the membrane real quick, and to do that, I'm going to add in a Gaussian blur, and I'm going to turn this up quite a bit, maybe to, I don't know, about, that's looking good. So we're about at 220, that's looking good. And I'm going to add in a levels effect. And I'm going to choose channel to alpha, and I'm going to move this down to where it's about here and move that up. It's looking good. So essentially what we've done is we've just crushed the blurriness on the outside to create this nice even alpha effect. So if we go in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and set some quick keyframes to show you. We set a keyframe there, and I move this over. Don't do this if you're following along in the tutorial. I'm only doing this to show you what it does. If we can look at here, we can see that when we squish the levels effect, that the cell kind of holds on to each other. There's kind of this stickiness between the cells, and that's just because of this Gaussian blur and levels effect, which is not from me. I want to add that I learned this technique from Mikey Borup and Joey from School of Motion. So go check out those guys' channels. They're really awesome and talented After Effects tutorial teachers. Go check them out. So I'm going to go back into our cell composition here, and I'm going to take off the position keyframes. And we're back trying to make the outer membrane. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a fill effect to turn these cells black. And I'm going to click OK, and they're still there. Don't worry, if we toggle our transparency, we can still see they're there. But one thing that I want to do is add in a layer style now. So I'm going to go to Layer, Layer Style, Inner Glow, just to create this outer area of the membrane. And my biology skills aren't very good right now, so I can't remember exactly what that outer membrane is called, or maybe it's just called an outer membrane. I'm not sure. But what I'm going to do is turn up the size a little bit. It's about 45. That's looking good. And I'll turn down the opacity to about 30. And instead of yellow, I think I want it to be white. So yeah, that's looking good. And I'm going to add in now a turbulent noise effect. So what I'm going for here is I want to create that lightning that was in the actual membrane of the cell in the original example. So I'm going to add in turbulent noise here. And the reason why I'm using turbulent noise instead of fractal noise is because turbulent noise tends to not be as intense on your computer whenever you're trying to render it out. So, but either one of them works. So it's not that big of a deal either way. So I added in, let's say, -60 on the brightness. And I turned up the contrast to about 400, and that's looking good. And so I don't want this to just be still the whole time, and like our turbulent displace effect, the turbulent noise isn't going to move by default. So I'm going to hold down Option again and select the keyframe on evolution, and I'm going to do time times 50 and click away. So now if we scrub through, we can see our turbulent noise kind of fluctuates in and out. That's perfectly fine. We just want it to be subtle like that. That's looking good. And the last thing I'm going to do is add in a vector blur effect. And this is a fantastic effect if you're wanting to ever create lightning or just some organic style bulges. And I typically use this whenever I'm doing anything that's supposed to be molecular or organic in any way. So I'm going to turn this amount up, maybe to about there. It's looking pretty. Actually, you know what? I'm going to crank this up pretty high. Let's actually do something like 120. And I'm going to actually turn up the smoothness quite a bit. And the softness I'll turn down a little bit. So this is looking pretty good. We have these just two cells that are kind of connecting here in the middle. That's looking good. And we have this like lightning organic effect thing that's going to be our outer cell membrane. Liking the way that's looking, and I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift Command C to pre-compose, and we'll call this outer membrane. Click OK. So now we have our outer membrane, and then we have our cell home, which has our original cells there. And what I want to do is, before we go ahead and composite the nucleus to the membrane, I'm going to go in and add a glow effect to our outer membrane. So I'm going to add in glow here. And I'm going to turn up glow quite a bit. Let's see here. About there. It's looking good. Maybe a little bit more. Just where it's just barely starting to peek through. That's looking good. And instead of original colors, I'm actually going to do blue. So just select the blue there. It's looking good. And maybe we even want to turn up the threshold just a little bit more. Something like that. Yeah, I'm liking the way that's looking. Looking very good. And I'm going to go ahead and set the transfer mode to screen. It won't make a difference right now because our background's black, but as soon as we start compositing everything together, this is going to look really good. So the next thing that we want to do is drag in our original cell home layer, this layer here, into our composition that has our outer membrane. And before we get going here, I'm going to go ahead and I'll call this final composition, just so we don't get lost here. And I'm going to go ahead and drag in our cell home layer. So now we have our original cells on top of our outer membrane. This is looking really good. And I'm going to add in a simple choker effect to the cell home layer. And I'm going to turn it up all the way. And what we're trying to do here is create a nucleus. And I'm going to go ahead and actually name this nucleus. I'm terrible at spelling, so I'm sure that's not how you spell that. That's okay. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the simple choker a couple times. Let's say 3 times. I'm not going to turn it up anymore. And I'm going to add in a blur effect to this as well. So we'll do Gaussian blur. And I'm going to turn this up a little bit, maybe to about 75. That's looking good. And I'm going to go to my levels effect here and change the channel to alpha. And just as before, we're going to take the top slider and bring it down here and take the bottom slider and pull it up a little bit. And you know what? I think the nucleus is looking a little big, so I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the simple choker one more time. Yeah, that's looking good. Awesome. So the next thing that I want to do is, just as before, I'm going to add in a turbulent noise effect to create kind of a cloud in the middle, and I'm going to boost up the contrast quite a bit. And that's looking good. And I'll turn down the brightness right about there. It's like maybe a little bit more, maybe something about there. So we have 529 on the contrast and -10 on the brightness. Yeah, this is looking pretty good. And now what I'm going to do is add in a vector blur effect. Well, I tell you what, before I add in the vector blur effect, I want the nucleus to also warp and rotate like the other layers. So I'm going to hold down Option and click Evolution again. And I'm going to do time times, and we'll do 25 because we don't want the nucleus to move around as much as the outer membrane. So this is looking good, and I'm just going to click away. And as we can drag it, and we can kind of, it's hard to tell because it's kind of causing the computer to render out a little too much information, but it is moving. If you look through the pixels, you can see some stuff moving there, and it'll look fine. So what I'm going to do now is add in the vector blur effect like we were talking about, and I'm going to crank this up to, let's say about, I don't know, maybe that's a little too much. Maybe we want to do something like 68. Yeah, you know what, that's looking pretty good. Maybe a little bit more to reach this orb-like mesh that is just holding in all these nucleus things. I don't think those are protons and neutrons, but whatever it is in a nucleus, that's what it is. And I'm going to turn up the contrast here a little bit, and the brightness again, maybe a little bit less. Yeah, something like that. That's looking good. So the next thing I'm going to do is add in a glow effect. Glow. And I'm going to drag this onto the nucleus, and I'm going to turn up the radius just a little bit, and AB colors, and I'm going to select a red for the nucleus here, and we'll turn up the threshold more, turn it up. It's looking pretty good. And again, I'm going to set the transfer mode on this layer to screen, and now we have this bright white nucleus in the middle with an outer membrane on top. It's all looking pretty good. And you know what? I'm going to turn up the glow on the membrane a little bit more to make it a little more sci-fi like. It's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll turn down the intensity a little bit. Yeah, I'm liking that. That's looking pretty good. So this is looking good. I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose this, and we'll call this composition, let's think, composite layer, or composite composition rather, and click OK. We're currently now in our finished composition, and we have our composite composition in here. We have our outer membrane, and then if we click again, we have our cell composite or cell home layer. And so one thing that I want to do is I want to parent the position of these cells in our cell home composition to null objects in this final composition. And the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to create two new null objects real quick. And I'm going to name this left cell, and I'm going to name this one right cell. And I'm going to actually grab the little handles here and put this on top of each other. So one thing you may not know is you can actually pick, whip, and parent layers between compositions. And this is super handy if you're working on templates or tools, or even if you're trying to do an effect like what we're doing here. So what I'm going to do is in our final composition layer, I'm going to hit P to open position. And I'm just going to, first off, I'm going to move both of our layers to the center here, both of our cell layers in our cell home composition. And now I'm going to parent them to one of the null objects. So I'm going to do position on the left cell for cell 1 and hold down Option and click position, pick whip to the position on the right cell. And so now I'm going to go ahead and drag this down here. So now if we grab one of the null objects, we can see that our cell bends and morphs. This is looking pretty good. Nice. So let's go ahead and set some keyframes here. So I'm going to set one at 1 second here. This is good. Hit P and set a keyframe. And I'm going to move ahead 3 seconds to 4. And I'm going to set another keyframe. And we'll do right cell, so we'll move it all the way to the right here. And then for the left cell, we'll move it all the way to the left. That's looking good. And I tell you what, in order to make it easier whenever we're in the graph editor, I'm going to hold down Control and click and separate dimensions for all of these. I'm actually going to turn off the Y position. I'm going to turn off the Y position keyframes so that we're only dealing with X position. So I'm going to select one of the keyframes and click Graph Editor, and the Graph Editor just basically allows you to have further control over the way in which your keyframes are going to interact with each other, or rather the way in which your keyframes will interpolate the data between them. So I'm going to create this nice little S effect. And what that's going to do is just make it to where it slowly pulls apart and it kind of moves faster and then slows back down towards the end. And so that's looking good. I'm going to select the left cell and do the same thing. I'm going to make a nice S effect. And now if we look, you can see our cells slowly divide apart and then they kind of pull real quickly there at the end. That's looking good. So now what we're going to do is stylize our final composition, because you'll see it doesn't really look like the example I showed you earlier, and that's okay. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create a few details that we can add to the background, and so we'll call these red details. Click OK. So all I did is created a new solid there, and I'm going to add in a turbulent noise effect. And we'll bump up the contrast pretty high and bring down the brightness to where we have this right here. That's looking good. And I'm going to go ahead and add in a tint effect. And we'll map black to black, and we'll map white to red. And I'm going to add in now a Gaussian blur effect. Turn up the blurriness there. That's looking good. And yeah, I'm liking that. I'm going to go ahead and set our transfer mode to screen. And I'm going to move it below our cells there. That's looking good. And I'm going to duplicate that, and we'll call this blue details. And instead of red here, obviously, we'll just change it to blue. And I'm going to just change the evolution so it's just at a different place. Yeah, that's looking good. So one thing I want to do is create a background layer, and we'll just do maybe a deep purple, something like there. And I'm just going to throw this to the background. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And so you'll notice that our cell composition layer is not looking so hot, and I think that's because we haven't set this to screen. And then I also want to do two more things to the cell composition or the composite composition layer. I'm going to add in a glass effect, CC glass, and this is looking pretty good. I'm going to turn up the softness a little bit, and it just creates this kind of, I don't know, organic look to it. And I'm going to turn up our height to about 50. That's looking good. And maybe we change our displacement to, instead of going up, maybe it goes down. Yeah, something like that. So now these are looking way more organic and more like what I think a cell should look like. And the last thing I want to do is add in another glow effect. we're just going to give this one more round of glow that's blue. So I'm going to add in blue there. And turn up our threshold a little bit, blur it out. And actually, maybe I want to turn our threshold down to where it's not quite so white. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. I'm liking that. Maybe turn up the intensity. Nice. So now we have our cells that come together in the middle, and then they kind of split apart and form these two separate cells. And we'll preview this in just a second to see how they look. So yeah, this is looking pretty good. One more thing I want to do is maybe add in another detail layer. I'll just duplicate the blue details and maybe turn up the blurriness a little bit, move the evolution over, and maybe even just scale up the entire layer there. Nice, that's looking pretty good. And the last thing I want to do is maybe do some quick color correction here. So I'm going to add in a new adjustment layer, and I'm going to add in the curves effect. And whoop, added it to the wrong composition there. Add in to the adjustment layer, and I'm going to pull up the blacks a little bit. Maybe turn it up to like right about there. And under blue, I'm going to bring up the shadows of the blue and down in the highlights to kind of create this two-tone effect. And I'm liking the way that's looking. And yeah, it's looking pretty good. I dig it. So let me go ahead and render this out, and let's take a look at what it looks like. All right, so this is looking pretty good. One thing that I can definitely see in this example that was not in the example I showed you earlier was the nucleus is way too bright. So we can scale that down by going into our composite composition, and in both of our layers here we have a glow effect. So I'm going to turn down the threshold of the blue just a little bit, but more on the nucleus we want to turn down the threshold. Turn it down to about there. And tell you what, one thing I'm going to do in our nucleus, so if you go back and remember, before we added in our glow effect, we just had basically a turbulent displace, or a turbulent noise effect, creating this white and black blob thing. What I'm going to do is add in a tint effect so that our glow isn't trying to glow a white object. Instead, it's trying to glow a red object. And so now that's a good amount of red, and I'm going to turn on our glow and turn up the threshold just a little bit. Yeah, that's looking much, much better. And so when we jump back into our final composition, it should look much better. Yeah, that looks a lot more like what a cell should look like. Let me turn up the threshold again on this glow here on our composite composition layer. A little bit more. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. I'm liking that. And one more thing that I can see is I don't want the membrane to be glowing more or a lot more than the nucleus. So I'm going to double click back into our composition or our composite composition, and on the outer membrane I'm going to turn up threshold to max. Turn down the radius and turn down the intensity. One thing that we could also do is under layer styles, turn up the opacity of the outer membrane. It's looking good. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and set this to blue. Cool. Yeah, that's looking good. So in the final composition, we can jump back in and turn up the threshold just a little bit. That's looking good. Awesome. So let me go ahead and render this out. All right, I'm really liking the way this is looking. I think the movement looks good. I like how it's kind of stretching and pulling apart. I think that's exactly what we wanted. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is add in one more stylization element. I'm going to create a new solid, Command Y, and we'll call this red light leak, and we'll make it red, maybe like a deep red, something like there. And I'm going to go in and use our rectangular mask tool and maybe select that much of the composition and feather it out. Set our transform mode to add. Yeah, that's looking good. And I'm going to duplicate that, and we'll call this blue light leak layer. And I'm gonna hit Command Shift Y to open up our solid settings, and we can actually change this layer to blue. It's looking good. And we'll change the rotation to be exactly 180 degrees. So now we have blue on one side, red on the other, and we'll maybe turn down the opacity of these just a little bit. All right, yep, that's looking good. And let's take a look at our final result here. All right, so I'm liking the way this is looking. I like that it pulls apart. I think that's nice and organic. The colors, I dig the red and blue scheme. I think there's a few things that we can do to make the colors even better, maybe going in and changing some of the exact color properties on some of the glow layers so it's not as cyan but maybe a deeper blue. We could probably even use a few blur effects to make it even better, but instead of me telling you how to do that, why don't you tell me how you think you could make this better? If you want to learn more about After Effects, please check out my website, cward.org, or follow me on Twitter. That's @CalebWWard. Again, this has been Caleb Ward, and we'll see you next time.